Welcome, everyone. Before I turn it over to Abdul, we're going to get started with a prayer, just wanting to reflect our Catholic and Dominican values here at Caldwell before we get into our wonderful speaker that we're able to have with us today. So the prayer that I chose is actually from Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. I thought it was very fitting for our topic today to start us off. A true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies. We are called to play the Good Samaritan on life's roadside, but that will only be an initial act. One day we must come to see that the whole Jericho road must be transformed so that men and women will not be constantly beaten and robbed as they make their journey on life's highway. True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It is not haphazard and superficial. Compassion sees that an edifice that produces beggars needs restructuring. A true revolution of values will soon look uneasily on the glaring contrast of poverty and wealth. So let us pray. Ever-present God, you called us to be in relationship with one another and promised to dwell wherever 2 or 3 are gathered. In our community, we are many different people. We come from many different places and have many different cultures. Open our hearts that we may be bold in finding the riches of inclusion and the treasures of diversity among us. We pray in faith. Amen.
Thank you, Colleen, for that prayer. Good morning, everyone, and especially good morning to our Caldwell University students, faculty, staff, and administration, as well as to the many community members with us today. We graciously extend to each of you a warm, hearty welcome. We are encouraged that you are joining us today for what is sure to be an excellent educational opportunity. Today, we're excited to host Tim Wise, who is among the most prominent anti-racist speakers, writers, and educators in the United States. He has spent the past 25 years speaking to audiences on over 1,000 college and high school campuses and to corporate, government, media, and law enforcement professionals on methods for dismantling racism in their institutions. Today, we're delighted he is with us in a virtual setting to deliver his presentation entitled, Not Giving Up, Maintaining Our Commitment to Justice in Unjust Times. The motivation behind this event is similar to what many of us have experienced all across the country. The murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many others sparked a sense of urgency. For us, this urgency led to introspection. And in those moments of introspection, 2 points crystallized. One, as moved as we all were to dismantle the present day oppressive systems that allow people of color to be unjustly murdered, we also must understand and work to dismantle the oppressive systems of yesteryear that allowed for violence against people of color. Trayvon Martin's death, for instance, is all the more painful because of Emmett Till's gruesome murder. So while we are moved by recent atrocities, we had to sit with and recognize that this is not a new fight. And so what this means is that for people of color, this trauma spans generations. Secondly, in our moment of reflection, we also understand that bringing change to our institution begins with each of us. And so before we can lead and work with our students in bringing and creating a more inclusive community, we must first, as an institution, recommit ourselves to this work, but making it a priority and exerting the time and energy necessary to make progress, whether that's in the form of identifying systems that allow folks to feel othered, reading books that center people of color, or simply engaging in difficult conversations with colleagues about privilege and what that means. We also wanted to name that this work does not fall at the feet of people of color, which is why we are encouraged that so many allies have joined us today. For allies and people of color alike, we all have roles to play in making ourselves, our communities, and our institutions more inclusive and in dismantling the wall that is white supremacy. With that, we are looking forward to today's presentation and the meaningful takeaways we will all learn. Before I turn things over to our presenter, we would like to share just a few announcements. First, this presentation is being recorded and will be made available in the weeks ahead. Next, the presentation will have a short time for Q&A following. So if you have questions, comments that you'd like to have answered, please submit those in the chat at some point during the presentation, and our team will pose those to the presenter after the session ends. Lastly, we wanted to acknowledge that the Office of the President, the Sisters of St. Dominic, Athletics, EUF, Counseling Services, the Office of Academic Affairs, Student Engagement, and the Office of Student Life had made this event possible. So thank you to all of our sponsors. Finally, as October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, I'd be remiss if we did not take a moment to acknowledge, at a bare minimum, the work that still needs to be done in this movement as well. So to all the survivors out there, I see you. I thank you for displaying strength, courage, and resiliency. And as an institution, we are fighting for your behalf. And now I'll turn things over to Tim Wise.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity to be with y'all, even if it's only virtually. This is our new normal, obviously, for the time being. And it is certainly great to be able to join with you and to share some thoughts and then to engage in some conversation with you once I'm done. A couple things up front. I say this as a matter of sort of disclaimer, because I know if I don't, something will happen. I am a 52-year-old man who has no technological skills whatsoever. So it is incredibly possible, even likely, that at some point I'm going to hit a button, I'm going to knock my computer over, I'm going to disconnect myself from the internet somehow. And unfortunately, I guess fortunately, but unfortunately, my high school junior has actually started back into school in person. So she's not in the house to save me. So I have to figure it out on my own. But I will try. In the last 4 months, I've only had that happen once, maybe twice. I'm hoping today will not be the third time. But if I don't tell you that, you'll wonder if I go blank here, you'll think I ditched you and I didn't want to hang out with you. And that's not the case at all. I have the link. I will get back on and we will continue if anything goes amiss. Again, it is great to be able to be with you. It would have been great under any circumstances and an honor, of course, to be with you under any circumstances. In some ways, it is even more important and more valuable for us to spend this time now because of the particular moment that we are in, both in terms of this coronavirus pandemic moment, which is, of course, not just a public health emergency, though it is that, but also a racial justice issue, because we know that the mortality rate for Black folk, Indigenous peoples, and Latinx folks is about 2.5 times the rate per capita for white folks. So about half of the persons who have died thus far, about 210,000 deaths, about 100 to 105,000 of those Black and brown folks. This is a racial justice moment. And it's important for us to frame this in that context. But of course, also, we are in the midst of what is undoubtedly the largest racial justice uprising in the history of the country, just in sheer terms of numbers. Since late May, after the killing of George Floyd, of course, after the killing of Breonna Taylor back in March and Ahmaud Arbery as well in the spring, this racial justice uprising over the course of the summer and continuing today has witnessed about 11,000, according to some estimates, 8,000 according to others, but either way, pretty impressive, between 8,000 and 11,000 demonstrations, protests, rallies, or other events on behalf of racial justice and as part of this larger movement for Black lives. Those protests have involved approximately 23 million individuals overall. There has never at any point in our history been an uprising for racial justice, or probably any cause that has involved that many people at one time. So obviously we are in a very special and propitious moment and exciting moment. And it's all the more important for us in the midst of that uprising to really take some stock of where things stand in terms of this movement and what our role is going to be in continuing the momentum that has been extant all throughout the course of the summer. Because obviously it isn't enough to have a movement that burns on high heat for 5 months. We have to figure out how to sustain this effort and how to move this effort to the next level, both within our institutional spaces like colleges, but also in the broader society. And I think it is worth noting something about this moment, because, when the uprising began after the killing of George Floyd, there were a lot of people who wondered, and I think understandably so, especially Black and brown folks who wondered it, why it was that this was the spark that brought so many people out into the streets, right? Because in many, many ways, we had seen that movie literally before, right? We had seen Black folks killed by agents of the state on camera before, and it had not led to this. We saw Eric Garner choked out on the streets of Staten Island several years ago, and there was no mass uprising like this that resulted from that. We saw Tamir Rice, a 12-year-old child, killed by a police officer in a public park playing with a toy gun several years ago. That led to outrage, but not this kind of uprising. We saw John Crawford killed outside of Dayton in Beaver Creek, Ohio, in a Walmart there by agents of the state, by a law enforcement official a few years back. That led to outrage, but not this level of uprising. We saw Alton Sterling killed by a cop in Baton Rouge on camera several years ago. That did not lead to this level of uprising. We saw the aftermath of the killing of Philando Castile, also in the Twin Cities area several years ago, on camera. That did not lead to this level of uprising. So there were a lot of folks who were sort of curious, why now, right? Now, I suppose you could say that it's in part the, one more drop of water over the edge of the dam that bursts the dam, or the straw that breaks the camel's back, or whatever metaphor you prefer. And maybe that's true, but I have to also believe that in part, the reason that we are in the midst of this uprising, and this is both valuable for the moment, but also, sort of portends some potential dangers if we're not careful down the line, is that in this particular moment, that killing took place against a backdrop of the coronavirus crisis, during which most of us were in sort of lockdown mode, right? And being locked down, being in this sort of relative quarantine space, I realize that wasn't true for everyone. I realize first line health responders and, folks that are stocking the shelves at the grocery and getting the goods to market, their lives really didn't change, except they became more dangerous. They went about their normal routine. But for most of us, we weren't going about our normal routine since like mid-March. And because we were in this lockdown mode, there was this relative quiet that existed, right? Not as much background noise going on in the back of our day-to-day routine, because we weren't going about our day-to-day routine. So all of the normal distractions that would have existed and would have perhaps made it easier for us to not see and to not hear and perhaps not to feel what was going on, whether it was with George Floyd or Breonna Taylor or Ahmaud Arbery or others, suddenly that background noise was muted, right? Suddenly we had the relative quietude to allow us to see things that perhaps we had missed before, hear things that we had refused to hear before, and feel things that we hadn't felt before, especially those of us who are white. Black and brown folks, of course, had been raising their voices about all those incidents that I mentioned before, and had been leading a movement going back many, many years, generations really, an intergenerational movement for Black lives and for human dignity. But this uprising involving so many people who had never been part of that before, white folks especially, but also some Black and brown folks who had not been in the streets before, I think has to have something to do with this moment of coronavirus lockdown. Now, the good news about that, if there is any, is that it means that perhaps in the midst of all this tragedy, 200,000 plus who have died, we may yet be able to pull a thread of positivity out of that. As horrible as that is to say, we may be able to find that silver lining, in the sense that we'll be able to turn tragedy into a motivation for real social change. And if that happens, that obviously will not redeem the lives of those who have died. It certainly won't bring them back, but it will mean that they have not died entirely in vain. And so it opens up an opportunity for us to take tragedy and turn it into something meaningful for our country. The bad news about the coronavirus being perhaps the reason why this uprising was made possible is that eventually we're going to be on the other side of this thing, and hopefully sooner rather than later, right? We don't want this to drag on just to provide the relative quiet that allows us to see racism and see the social fabric tearing. We want this crisis to pass. We want families to stop having to bury their loved ones and their friends. But when we get on the other side of this, whether that's in a month, whether that's in 6 months, or whether that's sometime later next year, we have to make sure that the momentum that was built up in the midst of this tragedy can be sustained even when this particular tragedy has passed, right? And if this particular tragedy is what created the space for us to hear and to see and to feel, then the question becomes, will people still hear? Will they still see, and will they still feel when they go back to work the way it used to be, quote unquote, or they go back to school the way it used to be, or they go back to their social routine? Will that momentum remain? That's up to us, right? But it's a question that we have to ask, and something that we have to think about, because even though this moment is incredibly promising And as someone who's been at this for 30 years doing anti-racism work, either as a grassroots activist, community organizer, educator, or writer, or all of those things, I can tell you I feel more positive about the potentiality of the movement now than at any point. But I also have this trepidation because I understand not only how movements are built and how they are sustained, but how they die, or how they lose steam and how they lose momentum. And that's what I want to talk with you about today, because as I think we know, just logically, it's very hard for a movement to burn on high flame all the time, right? And when you see people going from sort of 0 to 100 in 3.5 seconds, metaphorically speaking, right? Which a lot of people did, people who haven't been in the movement suddenly joining it. On the one hand, that's great. And I'm never going to be one of those people. I know there are some who think that they should look at people who have just joined the movement and sort of lecture them about where have you been and scold them for not having seen the problem before. I find nothing functional about that at all. I don't think that woke scolding newcomers to the movement is helpful to the movement, especially because a lot of the people that are doing that woke scolding only got woke like a week ago, metaphorically speaking. So if you're going to get on somebody on Thursday for not knowing some stuff that you didn't know until Monday, right, you're sort of leading with arrogance and not really worried about building a movement strategically. So I have no time for that idea that like, well, where were you? We've been dying forever, and where were you? Black and brown folks have been dying forever. Where were you? I don't care when you come to the party, as long as you get there and then you commit to doing the work, right? That's what matters, not when you got there. But the problem is that when you get there in that sort of moment of crisis, when you go from 0 to 100, the question is, can you sustain that energy? And that's hard to do, right? It's like if you start a bonfire and it burns on high heat, right? It tends to consume itself much more quickly than if it is stoked over time, right? Because it consumes the fuel source. Or if you had like a drag strip racing car, right? Those street racing cars that go from like 0 to 120 in like 5 seconds or whatever. They got a TV show about that now. Those cars, when they like zoom down the street, I'm pretty sure that when they're done, you got to go in and like tinker with the engine. You can't just drive that thing around the neighborhood now, right? Because it tends to burn itself out. You got to fix some stuff pops, some stuff starts smoking. You can't always burn on a high heat, and you can't always gun the engine on the highest setting. Sometimes you have to also think about medium-term to long-term strategies. And so I worry about the sustainability of a movement that started so fast, at least for some people. I mean, it's been there forever for others, right? But for some folks, this mobilization, this uprising went metaphorically from 0 to 100 very, very quickly. From Memorial Day, the killing of George Floyd, to like mid-June, right? And we had hundreds of thousands of people already spilling into the streets, which is excellent, but very hard to sustain. So I want us to think about the things that, if we aren't careful, could torpedo this mobilization and this uprising. And then how do we respond to those things? How do we ensure that they don't happen, right? I think there are 5 things that we need to be thinking about in this moment with regard to this particular uprising, that if we aren't careful, can torpedo the uprising and not scuttle the movement, but set the movement back. I don't think the movement will ever be eradicated. This movement, led by Black and brown peoples, has been going for hundreds of years. It's not going to go anywhere. But the question is, are we going to set it back, or are we going to move it forward? Those 5 things, one of them, we can't necessarily control. We don't have a lot of control over it, but 4 of them, I think we do. Those other 4 are sort of in our hands. And so that's the stuff that we really want to focus on. Let me tell you the one that we don't have complete control over. It's not that we don't have any. There are ways that we can influence it, but there's one that, simply reemerges in every generation and has been the sort of Achilles heel of anti-racist movement historically. And that is the looming specter of white denial and white backlash to social justice, anti-racist movements. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, the white denial piece ought to be relatively obvious. As I said before, we've had these cases of unarmed, innocent Black folk killed by agents of the state. We've had other evidence of systemic racism going back a very long time. And yet, for most of American history, whether we wish to acknowledge it or not, for most of American history, the vast majority of white Americans have continually hit the snooze button on that alarm clock and gone back to bed, and have opted not to see what is right in front of us and what Black and brown folks are trying to point out to us, even at the height of the civil rights movement. Now we look back at that now, right? And we think that was a high watermark of activism. And we see all these folks in the street, and we see 200,000 people on the Mall in Washington in 1963 at the March on Washington. And we have this hagiographic, naive remembrance of that time as a time when everybody was engaged and all of these folks were out marching for justice. But the reality is not only that most people weren't marching, most people, particularly most white Americans, weren't even on board with the movement that was happening at the time. How do we know? We know because there was polling then, just like there's polling now. There were surveys then, just like there are surveys of public opinion now. And what those surveys found beginning in 1961, when the Freedom Rides began, was that at every single stage of protest activity and movement activity, the vast majority of white folks, I'm not talking about 52% or 58%, I'm talking 70%, 80% or more of white Americans said that they opposed the Freedom Rides, that they opposed the demonstrations, that they opposed the marches and the protests that were happening, that they actually believed that those protests did more harm than good. That was where most white folks were in the midst of the greatest single human freedom uprising at that point in American history. And most white folks were like, yeah, I don't really think this is legitimate, right? And at that time in 1963, the time of the March on Washington, the year that Medgar Evers, head of the NAACP in Mississippi, was shot dead in his driveway in Jackson, the year that George Wallace, governor of Alabama, stood in the schoolhouse door at the University of Alabama and said, segregation today, tomorrow, and forever. The year that Bull Connor plowed those tanks through black neighborhoods and sprayed down children with water cannons and sick dogs on them. That year, the Gallup organization went out and did a poll of a large representative sample of white Americans, and they asked a very simple question. The question was, do you think black folks are treated equally in your community in housing, education, and employment? Now, in retrospect, right, we're 57 years after that question was asked, we all know the answer to that question in 1963, right? If I asked anybody out there today, doesn't matter what your politics are, it wouldn't matter whether you thought racism was a big deal now or not, right? If I asked you, hey, in 1963, do you think black people were treated equally? Like, everybody knows the answer is no, right? That was before the Civil Rights Act was even passed. That happened the next year. It was before the Voting Rights Act was passed. That would be 2 years later. It was 5 years before the Fair Housing Act. So the question is easy, right? Even the Klan would have said no, right? They would have been happy about it. They would have been happy that it wasn't equal, but they wouldn't have denied that it was unequal, right? But at the time, in 1963, when white folks were asked that question, 2 out of 3 white Americans, right? 2 out of 3 white Americans told Gallup pollsters, yeah, I think everything's pretty good. I think black folks are already treated equally, meaning 2 out of 3 white Americans didn't see the need for the civil rights movement, right? Didn't see the need for the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, because everything was already good. In 1962, the same Gallup pollsters asked white folks, hey, do you think black children have the same chance to get a good education in this country as white children? Again, come on, it's an easy question with an easy answer, right? That was only 8 years after the Brown v. Board decision theoretically, got rid of separate and unequal schooling. But it was before any school system had actually moved to fundamentally change the structures of inequality. And already 85% of white folks, when asked that question, said yes, black children have fully equal opportunity to get a good education. What does it say that even at the height of the movement, at a time when this country was still a formal system of white supremacy, not informal, not de facto, de jure, a formal legal system of apartheid, 2 out of 3 or 8.5 out of 10 white Americans said, yeah, no, I don't really see what the big deal is. Well, what it says to me is that this denial is deeply embedded, and there must be reasons why most white Americans, with exceptions duly noted, because there have always been allies who acted in solidarity, and we should hold them up, but we must remember they are a distinct minority, that the vast majority of white Americans have gotten it wrong, generation in and generation out, without fail, going back hundreds of years. And given that history, we ought to start with a certain degree of caution about the likelihood that most white Americans are going to get it right now, right? We ought to start with a certain skepticism to believe that suddenly white America has turned this moral corner when we did not. at the height of the civil rights movement, when we did not at the height of lynching in this country 30 and 40 years before that, when we did not during the period of enslavement have that moral awakening, I find not impossible, but I find relatively statistically unlikely. And so we have to begin with a certain degree of skepticism and realize that if we are banking on this white moral awakening in the wake of the killing of George Floyd, if we are banking on white folks suddenly waking up from this intergenerational slumber, stopping the hitting of the snooze button and getting up out of bed and joining this struggle and staying in the struggle, we are betting against hundreds of years of experience. So we have to figure out how we break through that white denial, right? We have to figure out why it is that white Americans have engaged in that denial, or even worse, what Carol Anderson, brilliant scholar at Emory University, has called white rage in her book of that same name, where she talks about how every step forward in the struggle for Black freedom and liberation and human dignity has been met with a concomitant backlash of white rage. It happened after the end of enslavement. It happened after the Great Migration, when Black folks left the South and moved north and were met with mass violence and lynching and racial pogroms, orgies of violence and riots in their communities burned to the ground in some cases, people killed in East St. Louis, Illinois, and Omaha, other places, not the South, the Midwest, the West, the Northeast, right? We have to be prepared for that backlash, that white rage and that white denial, because that's the norm. What we're in right now with all this talk of allyship, this is not the norm. Let's hope it can become the norm, but we just need to understand what we're up against. And then we need to ask ourselves, how do we take that from being the outlier in the white community to being more normalized in the white community, right? And that's what I think we do have some control over. So that's the good news. There are some ways that we can meet this moment and bring this movement into the minds and the hearts and the living rooms of white America, and begin to really build solidarity across lines of racial identity and racial difference in a way that may help us sustain the movement. But we have to be on guard against a few things that could torpedo our efforts if we are not careful. These are the four things that we have some control over. Number one, we have to be very careful that we don't allow this issue and this moment to be reduced to pure politics. One of the things that worries me, and it has always worried me in this work, is that our awareness of social issues, right, tends to be connected to the political cycle that we are in, right? So during the period when Barack Obama was president, those of us who do this work, we spent the better part of 8 years just simply trying to prove, especially to white folks, including a lot of nice white liberal folks, that racism was still a thing, right? Because there was this widespread belief that the election of a Black president had somehow moved us to this post-racial place. Now I think that bubble of a fantasy has been burst rather obviously, and if it hasn't been for you, there's like nothing that I can say today, obviously, that's going to be of any value to you. That should be glaringly clear. But that was the thing. We were so tied into thinking that racism either rises or falls based on who's the president that we forget that racism is this longer term systemic force. And then when Donald Trump became president, right, there was this outpouring of, outrage and anger among liberal and progressive folks. Oh my God, look at Charlottesville and look at all of these horrors and horrific things that the president has said. But again, true as all of that is, that runs the risk of reducing this problem to a problem that can be solved as soon as he's gone, right? The idea that if we can just change who's the president, if we can just change who the senators and the congresspersons are, if we can just change who the governors or whoever our lawmakers are, that somehow this problem will go away. And I worry that because this uprising is happening in an election year, it's very easy for energy to be diverted. And I'm not saying that people shouldn't be focused on the election and doing what they can to do whatever they believe in, right? I'm just saying that the danger is that, let's say Donald Trump loses and actually leaves office, which is, sort of open question, I suppose. Let's say that happens. Let's say that the constitutional process actually works and he loses and leaves. Does that mean that suddenly we can take a break, take a breather, take a vacation, assume that the problem has been solved? No, of course not, right? Because all the problems that we see right now were problems when Barack Obama was president. They were problems when George W. Bush was president. They were problems when Bill Clinton was president. They were problems when the first Bush was president, when Reagan was president, when Carter was president, right? It goes all the way back to the founding of the country and really to the colonial period. This is not a Republican or Democrat problem. It's not a liberal or conservative problem. It is a problem that is deeply embedded in the fabric of the country and every institution. So the wealth disparities, for instance, that exist right now, whereby the typical white family has about 12 to 15 times the net worth of the typical Black family, 10 times that of the typical Latinx family, those numbers really haven't changed, no matter who the administration has been, right? The fact that Black folks with a college degree are still almost twice as likely as white folks with a degree, even in the same major, same discipline, same occupational area, still twice as likely as those white folks with a degree to be unemployed, even when they both have the same kind of degree. That was true when Obama was president. That was true when Bush was president. And that's true now that Trump is president. So all of these things, whether we're talking about inequity in the economy, inequity in housing, inequity in wealth, inequity in the justice system. I mean, do administrations sometimes make these worse or better? Of course. It's not that they have nothing to do with it. It's not that they can't aggravate the situation. And I would never deny that the situation has been especially aggravated in the last couple of years, but we cannot run the risk of assuming that this is a merely political issue. We have to remember the problems were there before this administration, they're going to be there after. And if we talk about it that way, we have the ability to bring people in who maybe are not automatically natural allies, right? We're not going to be able to build an anti-racist movement just with the people who always vote the way we vote, right? The people who already consider themselves relatively progressive. Now, I don't think that we're going to ever build a movement that's going to include a lot of ultra-conservative people when it comes to this fight, because they've sort of staked their claim in a very different area. But there are people who aren't part of this struggle yet and who don't identify with a progressive or left politic who can nonetheless be brought into this, but it's going to be very difficult to do that if they assume that doing that means that they have to always vote for particular types of candidates and believe particular types of things across the board politically. We're going to have to do the kind of outreach that allows us to transcend partisan politics if we're going to build this movement and build this struggle. The second thing that I worry about is that we will reduce this movement to epic protest activity. And here's why I worry about that. You know, we think about the way that most of us were taught about the civil rights movement in this country. We were generally taught about it as if it were just a progression of epic protest and demonstrations, headline grabbing activities, and very little else. So generally, you know, we start with the Montgomery bus boycott, and then we jump ahead to the sit-ins in 1960. Maybe we talk about the desegregation of Little Rock Central High in 57, but sometimes we don't even get to that. We just skip over. We talk about the sit-ins, then we talk about the freedom rides the next year, then we jump ahead to Birmingham in 63, then we jump ahead to Selma in 65, and then we jump ahead to the assassination of Dr. King in 68. And we forget all of the stuff that was going on every day in between those events. So when you learn that the struggle is about marching and demonstrating and carrying signs and singing songs in the street to try to force politicians to do what you want, you forget the other part that isn't about that. And you assume that if we're not in the street this week, that something's wrong, right? Because that's what the movement is. The movement is marching. The movement is demonstrating. The movement is protest. Well, the movement is that. But the movement isn't just that, right? It's like the iceberg, you know, that you always hear about the iceberg, like 10% of it is above the waterline, right? And 90% of it is beneath the waterline. The same is true with social movements. 10%, the stuff you see, the stuff that gets headlines, the stuff that gets in the history books, precisely because it got headlines and there are good visuals in a media age, right? That stuff is the stuff you learn about. But the stuff that's beneath the waterline, the organizing, the strategizing, the knocking on doors, the getting together in church basements and meeting in small groups and planning how they were going to take on racism in the electorate, how they were going to take on racism in the schools, how they were going to take on racism in public accommodations, all of that stuff, often done by people whose names we didn't learn, right? And whose stories we don't know. That's the stuff that kept the movement together. You don't just bounce from one demo to the next. And my concern is that in the midst of this uprising, with those 11,000, you know, demonstrations and protests, or whatever the number is, involving 23 million people, I worry that what that did, as great as it is it's created an expectation that will always be happening, right? That we're always going to have that same level of energy. And so my worry is, let's say you had, you know, 10,000 people in the street in a certain community back in June or early July? And what if, oh my God, this time we only had 2,000? Oh my God, and what if only 700 people come? Oh my God, the movement's falling apart. What's happening? That's not a realistic assessment. Movements are not all about demonstrations and marches. And in fact, demonstrations and marches, absent the other stuff that you have to do behind the scenes, will not change anything. It's not as if somehow the movement just spilled into the streets and lawmakers were so scared of protesters with signs singing "We Shall Overcome" that they just were like, oh my God, I'll do whatever you want now. That's not what happened, right? There was long-term movement building, voter registration, the creation of freedom schools in Mississippi to challenge the existing schools, the creation of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party as a direct challenge at the 1964 convention in Atlantic City to the segregationist Mississippi Democratic Party at that time. There were creative ways of doing this work, so much of which we didn't hear about and we didn't learn about. And if you don't learn about that, it becomes very easy to always have your expectations on a 10 or a 9 when a lot of the work is happening down here at a 5, right? And already you're starting to hear some of this. I have heard people over the course of the last 2 months who have started to worry sort of openly in their writings and on social media about, well, where are all these people who said they were allies, and where are all these people that were marching back in June? They're not out there now. Again, if you were to think of this in historical terms, when the sit-ins started, I live in Nashville, that's where I am now. In 1960, when the sit-ins hit Nashville in February, they started in Greensboro on Feb 1 with 4 young men from North Carolina A&T University who sat down at Woolworth's. And 2 weeks later, they had spread to Nashville. And by the end of the month, they'd spread to several southern cities. The biggest of those, really, though, the sort of one that has the biggest attention within movement history is Nashville. When that happened in February of 1960, like the 14th or something, 14th and 15th is when it starts. If you were to overlay this moment on that moment in terms of, chronology, right? To be worried right now, just because there aren't demos happening every day, there's not mass mobilization happening every day, that would be like back in July of 1960, 4.5 months after the sit-ins, people starting to freak out and thinking, oh my God, the civil rights movement, it's dead. Nobody's demonstrating. We haven't taken over a lunch counter in 3 months. We haven't done any marches or big protests with lots. That would be absurd. The movement was just getting its footing in July of 1960, and there were all kinds of things to come, but it takes planning. It's not just the spontaneous eruption of outrage, right? That part is necessary, but it is not sufficient. And so we have to be prepared in these moments when maybe there's not a big demonstration happening, when maybe people's attention is on the presidential election and the election coming up. Can we plot and plan and strategize and think through tactics for what happens next? This is the moment to do that, right? It's hard to think strategically and tactically when you're out in the street. That's the moment for mobilization. That's the moment for community building. That's the moment for the expression of grief and outrage. But when you're not doing that, the goal is not to just figure out, well, when's the next time we can do that? The goal is to figure out, what do you do when you're not in the streets? What do you do in your workplaces? What do you do in your schools? What do you do in your community? How do you talk to these, to your friends or family or neighbors about these particular issues? So we can't just reduce this work to protest activity. The third thing that we have to be worried about, and which we can control, the first, again, reducing to politics, is dangerous. The second, reducing to protest, is dangerous. The third is forgetting who the enemy is. I think it's very easy for those of us who are engaged in this work, and like I said, I've been doing it for 30 years, and I've been guilty of this myself. So I never try to give advice to others that I don't need to remember for me, right? It is very easy when you are in the midst of your awareness and in the midst of your moral righteousness around this or any other issue, as I said before, to scold others who are not quite there yet, to jump down their throat, whether that is on social media, whether that is within your family, whether that is somebody that says the wrong thing in a classroom. Now, look, if someone really says overtly racist stuff and does something overtly bigoted, I got no problem putting those folks on blast and letting them know exactly what it is they did wrong. I have no problem with jumping down somebody's throat that really does overtly racist stuff. But we also have to remember that a lot of the things that people say and do, and a lot of the ignorance that people manifest, and the obliviousness that people manifest, is structured ignorance. And what I mean by that, it is ignorance and obliviousness that they have come by as a result of existing in a society that encouraged that ignorance. right? In a society that encouraged that obliviousness. We have come by it honestly, as the saying goes. And we have to remember that our ignorance and our obliviousness and that denial that I mentioned before is structured by the systems within which we operate, which is what we need to focus on. We need to be harder on the system and less hard on people, because people are the product of their systems. That doesn't excuse our behavior when we engage in foul behavior. It doesn't excuse our ignorance, but it does contextualize it. And if I want people to move from point A to point B, I have to decide what's more important, showing them that I know more than them and scolding them for not knowing what I know, which I only know because someone else taught me. And I might not have even thanked them yet, right? So I'm being a little haughty in the sense of, lecturing someone else for not being where I'm at. But in addition, it misses the point that the system is the problem. If people come through a K-12 educational system that doesn't talk about the history of systemic racism, why would you expect them to understand the current reality of systemic racism? If we come through a school system and we have parents who didn't go to schools that taught about that, why would we expect them to understand that now? If we live in a society that says, and ours does, that wherever you end up in this country is all about your own effort, that's our secular gospel, right? That's like Genesis 1:1. If America was a Bible, that's the very first line, y'all. You can be anything you want if you just work hard. If you grow up in that society and then you look around and you see disproportionately white people up here on the top of the structure and black and brown folks down here, racism becomes a logical default position for you. It becomes rational to say, well, I guess these people, they just must not work as hard. They just must not be as good. That doesn't even take a leap of faith. All you have to do is swallow what the country told you. All you have to do is imbibe Genesis 1:1 in the Bible of Americanism and not learn to question it, not learn to question the notion of rugged individualism, not learn to question the myth of meritocracy, and you will default to a racist conclusion. You will default to a sexist conclusion when you see men disproportionately up here and women disproportionately on the bottom of that structure. You will default to a classist position, which rationalizes the position of the wealthy relative to the poor and working class. That is not to excuse you when you default to that, but it is to say there is a context within which our obliviousness, our ignorance, and our bias is cultivated. And if we really want to change it, it is not going to do to beat people over the head for their ignorance. It is only going to do if we change that system. And if we think about how we can alter the systemic forces that perpetuate that. So we have to remember who the enemy is. Systemic racism is the problem. It isn't about interpersonal stuff. Interpersonal stuff is dangerous. I'm not saying it doesn't matter, but the larger issue is systemic. And there's a lot of confusion right now about that. You have a lot of folks who I think we talk about, and this is across the spectrum, people not understanding that. People on the right who, when they hear systemic racism, think that what we're saying is everybody's racist, the whole country's evil, America is inherently evil and horrible and racist. Nobody's saying that. That's not what we're saying. We're saying racism is woven into the fabric of the country. It has been there from the beginning. And it isn't an accident or incidental that we're dealing with it today. That really shouldn't be a radical concept. I guess for some people it is. There are other people who are also still focused on the interpersonal stuff, even though they are more progressive. So everyone that talks about, well, we got to deal with, implicit and subconscious bias in policing. We need to have more implicit bias trainings. I mean, whatever. There's no evidence these work particularly well. But unless the participants are highly motivated to deal with their stuff. And the research says cops are not highly motivated in most cases to deal with their stuff. There might be some who are. Teachers might be highly motivated to deal with their stuff. Sometimes physicians and nurses and social workers and people in the so-called helping professions, maybe they're more motivated. So there is some evidence that implicit subconscious bias training might work for them. But for police, the idea we're going to train people in an institution that was set up for the purpose of dominating some people for the benefit of others. I mean, that is the history of policing, right? The history of policing was not to protect everybody, right? The history of policing and law enforcement was to protect white people from black folks and indigenous people, right? It was literally slave patrols. It was literally controlling the movement and the freedom of black bodies and putting working class white people on the slave patrol to serve as the intermediary between the rich and the poor disproportionately being black folks as well as other poor white folks, right? So it was about protecting the haves from the have-nots. It was never about neutral public safety, right? And so the idea that you could just train people in an institution that was set up for this purpose to perform this purpose, no, you have to reconfigure the system, right? And I think sometimes we get so caught up in fixing people individually that we forget that you have machinery that is turning out dysfunction. And if you're sitting at the end of a conveyor belt in a sausage factory, don't be surprised when it keeps giving you sausage, right? If you're at the end of a conveyor belt in a sausage factory and you're complaining to your buddy that it hadn't given you a chicken nugget yet, right? You clearly need to walk back outside the factory and read the sign, because the sign told you what you should expect, which is sausage. So don't be shocked. You have to reconfigure the machinery. It's like if it were an app on your phone, there's no glitch, right? The inequality is not a glitch that they're going to send you a patch for over the weekend and you can, update your phone and it'll fit. No, the inequality is a feature of the system, right? So you have to actually think in systemic ways. The fourth thing that we have some control over, and that worries me in this moment that we might get wrong, is particularly for white folks who are trying to act in solidarity as allies to Black and brown leadership in this particular struggle for Black lives, is that we're not always clear on what our motivations are. And our motivations do matter. I mean, on the one hand, I want to see those bodies out there protesting. I want to see us all taking on this issue. And I'm glad to see so many white folks asking, how can I be a better ally? How can I be a better collaborator? How can I be a better co-conspirator? Whatever term you prefer, how can I join the struggle? But we need to be clear on what our motivations are, because some motivations for asking that question and engaging in this work are in fact healthier and more sustainable than others. What am I talking about? I'm very worried about the possibility that a lot of this motivation is shame and guilt, right? Because in the wake of the killing of George Floyd and the uprising, we saw a lot of white folks on social media and elsewhere, sort of pouring out their shame and guilt about how much they didn't know. Oh my gosh, I can't believe I didn't know this was happening. I didn't realize how bad it was. Showing up at rallies with signs that say, I'm sorry, I didn't know, but I'm here now. I mean, it's sweet and it's nice and it's, compassionate, but to be perfectly honest, shame and guilt has never liberated anyone from oppression, and it isn't sustainable for the person who feels it. When you feel shame or guilt about something, what do you think your motivation is? Your motivation is to get rid of that shame or guilt, to escape the shame or guilt. Shame or guilt has as its end purpose its own relief. And we can relieve that in a number of ways, but one of the ways that we tend to relieve shame, especially guilt, is not quite as bad. Shame is destructive. When you feel shame, you just want to stop feeling it. What's the easiest way to stop feeling it? You just stop thinking about the thing that makes you feel bad, right? You just run away from the thing that makes you feel bad. This is true not just with race, man. This is true with anything. Like, I've been in therapy off and on for a couple of years. Your therapist will tell you this. He told me that if you feel shame or guilt about something that you've done and you don't understand the root of it and you don't understand where it came from, you'll never fix it. You'll take all of that blame and that shame onto yourself, and ultimately you won't stay in the work, whether that work is movement building or whether that work is just fixing yourself, right? From whatever damage you have experienced in your life that now you're manifesting on your own kids or your own family or your friends or colleagues or whatever it is. So if we're motivated by shame and guilt, I don't think we're going to stay in this movement long, because ultimately we will want to do something else. The second thing I worry about is if the motivation is just pure moral outrage, I'm not sure that's sustainable. If white folks are suddenly running into the movement because we're so outraged at injustice, that's excellent. It's fantastic. We should be outraged. But is that sustainable? See, that worries me, because that is that high flame. That's that constant, I'm so angry, I'm so pissed, I'm going to go into the street. Well, if that is your motivator, is simple outrage, then every day that you're not out yelling and screaming and protesting is a day that you feel you're failing. It's a day that you feel the movement is failing, and then you get burned out and you start to get, pessimistic about the prospects for change, because you're looking for that next sort of high burn event, because that's what you think it is. Outrage does not lead you to want to go have a calm conversation with your neighbor, right? Outrage does not lead you to sit and talk with your family member or your colleague or your friend. Outrage doesn't really lead you to want to have deep, meaningful explorations of your own engagement with the system. Outrage just makes you want to blow up. And there might be a time for that. And there's certainly something positive about feeling outrage at injustice, but I don't think that it is a long-term strategy, not to mention The history of the country is outrage after outrage after outrage, which white folks sometimes got mad about for a minute and then went back to sleep. So I don't have any historical evidence that outrage is sustainable when it comes to allyship and solidarity. I'm not saying it might not be, I just don't see it. The third motivation that worries me is sort of the charity motivation. And we've seen some of this too. White folks who have poured into social media or even some of the demos and said, you know, I'm here to help. I want to help you with your issue. I want, you know, it's sort of this mentality of racism is a black and brown issue, but I'm going to lend my voice to your struggle. The problem with that is it comes very close to charity as opposed to solidarity, right? If I view racism as a black person's issue, as opposed to seeing it as my issue, as opposed to seeing it as a thing that was created by white folks for the benefit of white folks. Now what I'm doing is I'm saying like, oh, you poor people over here, you're in such pain, let me help you. The problem with that, other than the fact that it can be paternalistic, is I can easily get distracted by some other charitable cause next week, right? If I'm doing it to save other people, in addition to being paternalistic, I'm just, you know, it's anything else could attract my attention. Oh, well, now there are some other people over here in pain, so I'll shift my attention over here, right? And so I think the charitable impulse doesn't necessarily lead to solidarity. What it leads to is this notion that I'm here to fix you rather than I'm here to fix us, and I'm here to fix the society that is manifesting these injustices. So what's left? What might we do differently other than shame and guilt, other than moral outrage, and other than pure charity that can help us avoid reducing everything to politics, reducing everything to protest, and forgetting who the enemy is? Because if we're clear on our motivation, I think we can actually transcend all of those pitfalls. But we have to be very clear. What I would suggest is this. Number one, of course, we have to take a long-term view rather than a short-term view. We have to figure out stair steps of progress that we can attain, that are attainable. Many of those have been articulated by the Movement for Black Lives and their official sort of materials, both short-term and medium-term and long-term goals for sustainable change. We also have to start where we are. Right? A lot of times we think about this in big epic national terms and we forget we live in communities. We're educated in particular communities with particular histories. So that means your institution should be examining its own history with regard to racial equity and opportunity, where it has failed, where it has succeeded, how it has done, and how it can do better. And right there where you are in your neighborhood, in your community, in your town, and in the larger state. I think every state, every community, and every institution ought to do its own version of truth and reconciliation, like in South Africa. I don't happen to like the term reconciliation very much, because I think, you know, it's sort of hard to reconcile something which was never conciled in the first place, right? But the concept that they applied in South Africa and which has been used in Rwanda post-genocide there, it's been used to some extent in Northern Ireland as well. This idea of getting all of the facts out, what has happened, how we came from point A to point B, until people understand how we got where we are, not just as a nation, but right where you live. Locally, who lives in this neighborhood and who doesn't and why, who went to these schools and who didn't and why, who's in this university and who's not and why, where do we recruit and where do we not as actively recruit and why, you know, why do people have certain types of jobs and not other types of jobs and why? Unless we really interrogate that, it's going to be very hard to push for change because people won't understand the important need for change, right? They will default to that idea that things are the way they are, just because, well, wherever you end up is all about your effort. And so these people are here because they just worked harder or they're better. And these people are here because they didn't. So we have to think of really truth telling as a radical act in this moment. The final thing is about this motivation piece. I think we have to transcend shame, moral outrage, and charity and start thinking in terms of what the late, great legal scholar Derek Bell called interest convergence. Now, when Derek Bell used this term, he was using it somewhat cynically. His argument was that all progress in America when it came to the Black freedom struggle had only happened in moments when the interest of Black people happened to dovetail with the interest of the larger society, that it was never because of moral awakening, it was never because of a fundamental shift of consciousness, and it wasn't just the brilliance of pressure tactics, it was those things against a backdrop of what he called interest convergence. So he argued, for instance, You look at the Civil War, obviously the end of enslavement doesn't happen because Lincoln was particularly committed to fighting white supremacy. He was someone who believed that if he could have sent black folks back to Africa, he said he would have done it. He was simply trying to preserve the Union and said it could not be preserved half slave and half free. And so ultimately we go to war largely over that very issue, and enslavement ends, but not because of some great moral awakening, right? Because the practical needs of the country necessitated the end of enslavement. He moves forward to the civil rights struggle. He makes the point that the Brown v. Board of Education decision that outlawed segregated schooling and the larger civil rights struggle largely succeeded, not because the white segregationists suddenly woke up and said, oh my goodness, or that other white folks said, wow, we've been wrong all this time. But instead, his argument was we were in the middle of a Cold War, a propaganda battle with the Soviet Union at the very moment that colonized people in black and brown nations all around the world were coming out from under the boot of colonialism, looking for a model to follow. And it was a propaganda war between the West and the East. Whose model are you going to follow, right? Are you going to follow the American capitalist model? Are you going to follow the Soviet or perhaps the Chinese socialist or communist model? So in that moment, if you're trying to convince colonized brown folk and black folk to follow you and be part of your orbit of influence, how are you going to do that if you're oppressing people who look just like them? So you had to let the gas up, so to speak. You had to take the boot off a little bit just to put on a happy face, right? So if that's not happening, if we're not in the middle of that Cold War, do we have the same reforms at the same time? Possibly not. And he documented that in many of his books before his death and his writings before his death. He was using it cynically. He was saying, even the progress we've had has only been because of that. I'm using the concept a little differently. I agree with his assessment, but the way I'm using it is, my argument here would be that only if we can demonstrate to white folks that there is interest convergence in eradicating white supremacy will we likely sustain allyship and solidarity, right? Because moral outrage has never been enough, and I'm not willing to bank on it. I'm not willing to put all the chips on white folks having a moral awakening. I just don't think evolution happens that fast, especially when you live in a society that has subsidized denial and subsidized backlash as long as it has. So I'm not willing to bet on a moral awakening as much as I'd love to see one. I'm certainly not willing to bet on shame or guilt, and I'm not willing to bet on charity. But what I am willing to bet on is white folks starting to realize that this system of inequality is deadly, not only for black and brown folks, but even for a lot of us. How do I know that? Well, let me give you some examples of what I think I know. Right now, in the midst of this coronavirus, this COVID-19 epidemic, pandemic, where half the people have died are black and brown, half are white. Let me ask you a question. Do you think that we would have responded as a nation to this as cavalierly as we did, as nonchalantly as we did, from the top of government on down, if the people doing most of the dying disproportionately had been white or affluent or young or generally healthy, as opposed to black and brown, working class, pre-existing conditions and older? I don't. I think if it had been mostly advantaged groups that were suffering from this, the more privileged, the more dominant groups, we would have shut everything down and kept it shut. People wouldn't be showing up at the state capitol with camouflage and semi-automatic weapons demanding the right to open back the economy. They wouldn't be arguing about how standing 6 feet from the neighbor at Trader Joe's is tyranny, or having to wear a mask in the Costco is oppression. These folks would be at home and they would be demanding that the government just send them money to get them through the crisis, if it was people like them at the highest risk. But because it was mostly black and brown, because it was mostly working class, because it's mostly older folks whose lives we also don't value as much as the young because ageism is a thing, and because it's people who are sick who we don't value as much as the healthy because ableism is also a thing, and we look down on people with pre-existing conditions, which is why for most of our history we haven't protected them in healthcare. Because they were the ones disproportionately dying, folks said, well, we just got to get the economy back, man. We got to roll the dice. I mean, yeah, some people are going to die, but you know, they're 80 anyway, right? I mean, everybody dies sometime. What's the irony? The irony is, yeah, disproportionately, the people who died were black and brown, but 100,000 white folks are dead too. You got a lot of white families in this country who's lost their grandparents and their parents and their immunosuppressed children or spouses and partners and friends and loved ones because we rolled the dice on their health too. So perhaps the reason we rolled the dice was because we didn't think it was our problem, or people were convinced it was mostly those people, so we just have to live our lives. But as a result, the effect has been to reduce the to lower the threshold of acceptable loss even for white folks, right? Because once you create that hierarchy of human value, which says that white is more valuable than non-white, that rich is more valuable than poor, that young is more valuable than old, and healthy is more valuable than sick, ultimately you create this eugenic mentality that allows anyone who is deemed weaker, anyone who is deemed lesser, to be put down. Right? And that mentality of human disposability can't be contained in that container that maybe we created it for. That maybe that container was created for the purpose of dismissing the value of Black and brown life, but now that has seeped out and it's claiming a lot of white folks too. Second point, the opioid crisis. Why do we have this crisis right now? Why is it that we have hundreds of thousands of white folks who have died, 500,000 people approximately since the late 1990s that have died of drug overdoses, disproportionately white folks in small towns and rural communities without college degrees who were middle-aged, disproportionately overdosing on opioids or taking their own life directly via suicide. 90% almost of gun suicides in this country are white men. And that has spiked since the late 1990s. The experts call these deaths of despair. But why is this happening, right? Is it because white folks are in the most pain, the most economic pain? No. The data says Black and brown folks are still worse off in every indicator of well-being. You know what the difference is? White folks didn't think this would ever happen to them, right? To be white in America is to have been told that as long as you worked hard, played by the rules, did everything you were supposed to do, that your life would be relatively good, right? It'd be a 7 or better. Your kids would be better off than you. And if you were Black or brown, you knew it wasn't that easy. People of color always knew that was a myth, if not a lie. They knew they could work hard every day and get nowhere. But to be white, especially white and male, even if you didn't have a college degree, you figured as long as you played by the rules and worked hard, it would work out. And then what happens? The economy globalizes, and the very same forces that were buffering and buffeting and destroying Black communities in the 70s and 80s when the plants closed and when the jobs left. They left urban America literally 30 and 40 years ago and 45 years ago. And the very same people who are now complaining about the plants leaving their rural community and their ex-urban community in the Rust Belt are the same people who ignored that when it happened to Black folks. And now they're in such pain because they don't know how to deal with the gap between what they were promised and what was actually delivered. And so they turned to opiates to numb their pain. And because they supported the war on drugs, they voted for candidates that locked up Black and brown people for drug addiction. Oh, crack, heroin in the 70s, these are criminals. These people aren't redeemable. Lock them up. 3 strikes, you're out. War on drugs. Didn't want rehab, didn't want treatment options. And now what happens 30 years later? It's our children and our families and our communities that don't have the rehab and don't have the treatment. So you see that mentality that said, oh, to hell with those folks. They don't really count. They're to blame for their own problems. If they don't have jobs, they should just pick up and move where the jobs are. If they're in pain, drug use is no excuse for your pain. You should pull it together. It's a moral failing. And now that's come back to haunt white communities as well. And then finally, with regard to healthcare, there's research out of Harvard several years ago, which found that the #1 reason that we don't have universal affordable healthcare for all in this country, the biggest thing that causes white Americans to oppose that is the fear that if we had that or we had other strong safety net programs for those in need, that Black people would abuse the programs. And so we end up opposing programs that we need, programs that millions of white families also need, just because we don't want somebody else to take advantage of the program. A friend of mine, Jonathan Metzl, who's a professor at Vanderbilt just a few minutes from where I live, went out and did a book called Dying of Whiteness a couple years ago. I'd highly recommend that you give it a read. He went and he talked to a guy, white guy, working class, very sick, 41, 42 years old, dying of liver cancer or something, and didn't have any health care. And he's talking to this guy, and he says, look, man, why don't you get on the Affordable Care Act? Get on Obamacare. It's not perfect, but it's something, And his answer was he would rather die than be on Obamacare because that's for welfare cheats and illegal immigrants, his words. So he refused to get on the ACA. He is now dead. He died because he didn't want to get on a program that might have saved his life because it would have associated him with, quote unquote, those people. So you see what I mean when I talk about interest convergence? This isn't just Black and brown folks dying. This isn't just Black and brown communities suffering. We are literally killing ourselves just to be able to feel better than somebody else. We are literally risking our own lives and the lives of our families just to feel superior to someone else. That's unhealthy for everyone. If we start to talk about it that way, we begin to realize that it isn't just black and brown folks that need white supremacy and inequality to end. It's all of us who need white supremacy and inequality to end. And if we talk about it that way, this movement can be sustained. I appreciate y'all so much for hanging with me for this hour. I am now at the end of my time, almost perfectly as I look at the clock at the top of my computer. I will now stop and I will throw it to Q&A, and we'll do that for 20 minutes or so. But again, thank you all so much for having me. It's been a blast, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you. Thanks, y'all.
Great, thank you. So we have had 2 questions come in so far from the chat. So I'll start with those. And then if anyone has any other questions, just feel free to write them in the chat and I will, pass them along. And so we can have a little bit of a discussion. So, all right. So the first question says, when it comes to the anti-racism talks that you do, especially in relation to some of the things the president has recently come out with, is it a recent call to ban the type of talks that you do? And if so, is that the blatant white denial that you are talking about, or is this a more dangerous situation?
Well, I mean, that on the part of the president is just pure politicking and pandering to his base of voters. He doesn't know. The president of the United States has absolutely no idea what the term critical race theory means. And I'm not saying that to be disrespectful to him. Probably 95% of Americans don't know what it means, but he surely doesn't. So when he says we're going to ban critical race theory, I mean, I wish that a reporter would ask him, hey, just tell us what that is. We'll give you all day, just tell us what it is. You don't get to Google it, you just have to tell us. He couldn't do it. Most of his advisors couldn't do it. So all that is telling his base, these bad, awful, left-wing, Black Lives Matter people are trying to demean your country. They're trying to take down the statues of your heroes. They're trying to rewrite the textbooks. They're trying, it's just about this white grievance, white victimhood narrative that has been part of American politics going back. Interestingly, the first time that narrative is really put forward is when Black folks are still enslaved. There was still this narrative that, oh, these slave rebellions, these rebellions of enslaved people, they're attacking their owners. Nat Turner killed all these people. I'm sorry, if you kidnap me, I have the right to do whatever I got to do to get free. I don't think anybody would blame someone who had been kidnapped. A couple of years ago, Ariel Castro had kidnapped those 2 women, held them for like 10 years in Ohio, I think it was. And they escaped without having to kill him. But if they had knifed him in his sleep, I prefer nonviolence, but if those women had killed him in a moment of opportunity and escape, would we condemn them for that? No. So why would we condemn enslaved persons for killing their captors? But that's what they did. We're the victims. After the Civil War was over and the abolition of enslaved persons took place, the Supreme Court Justice Joseph Bradley in 1883 wrote an opinion where the court overturned all these civil rights laws that had been passed during Reconstruction and said, we're throwing these out. And the reason they said was it does too much for Black people and it makes white people victims. I mean, they use that same language. So that's all Trump's doing. He's I won't call it virtue signaling. He's vice signaling to his people that these people are coming for you. The reality is, he has no power to do any of the stuff he's doing. The executive orders, you can't just ban certain types of talks based on content. You can't tell schools and contractors what words they can and cannot use. I suppose it is possible that he can impose this within the executive branch. As long as he's president, he could probably say, we're not going to do any trainings within the executive branch on these issues. Or we're going to zero out the budget for those things. But I mean, the reality is, if any of this is tested in court, and it will be, it's going to be thrown out. You can't ban certain conversations based on the wording that's used or the concepts that are used. If he wants to zero out all the budget stuff for all trainings, all workplace development training, I guess he could do that. But I'm not particularly worried about it. I did have a couple things that canceled back in June because there was a government agency that had been planning on bringing me in to talk about allyship in the midst of the uprising. and somebody got wind of it, and the Trump people were furious, and they threatened to fire the two men of color who had organized the event. So naturally, we pulled out. We didn't want them to lose their jobs. I hope that they didn't face retaliation after we canceled it. They said they wouldn't, but who knows? I mean, there's this vindictiveness, and I think it's all very transparent to most people that it's not about, because if it weren't, look, if the Trump administration just wanted to say, we don't like your kind of trainings, we have a different model, right? We have a different model for talking about this, and we just don't like this model. Okay, well, show us what your model is. Like, if you've got a better way to do anti-racism and equity training, by all means, like, share it. But they don't have an alternative way. They just want to shut down the conversation. They cannot do it legally. And the only thing I worry about now is that you do have some institutions that get very nervous that they're going to be retaliated against. And so they sort of censor themselves, and they cancel the training out of fear that someone is going to yank their funding, even though I guarantee you it is not possible to do that legally. And so I hope that people won't buckle. I mean, so far I haven't seen a lot of people buckling, but there have been a few others who I know who do these trainings who have, for whom it's had an effect. But hopefully that won't last very long.
Great, thank you. Our second question asks, can you please discuss the role of church/Christianity in fostering racism, as well as the African transatlantic slave trade? It is vital to see how the church is still fostering institutional racism.
Right, I think it's really important for church communities within the larger body of Christendom in particular to think about the role of the church and the role of church iconography going back obviously many, many years now, the way in which that iconography is presented, particularly in the West, particularly in the United States, and the role that plays symbolically in reproducing and rationalizing white supremacy. Obviously, there are ways to look at Scripture, read Scripture, and teach Scripture, which are liberatory ways of doing that. The Black church has always tried to do that. The Black church looks at the Exodus story, for instance, as a metaphor for their own story. It is not just a story of ancient Israelites. It is their own story. And so there is a way in which the Black church has crafted their understanding of Christianity as an anti-white supremacist tract in many instances. James Cone has written about this, of course, and others within the movement of Black liberation theology have written about this. But the Black church more broadly has not always been that. I mean, there are also Black church folks that are not teaching liberation versions of Scripture, but many do. On the other hand, the white church had a very different narrative, and for very specific reasons. That Scripture was used deliberately as a weapon to rationalize enslavement. You can do that, of course, by picking various verses from Scripture that seem to, in fact, endorse enslavement, as long as you don't treat your enslaved persons too badly, right? There are certainly ways to read Scripture that way. And if you read it hyper literally, as some do, and they did for their own purposes, you will then be able to rationalize enslavement. We know that the curse of Ham theory was obviously used to rationalize enslavement before we had biological theories of racism. So now racism tends to be rationalized by appeals to science. Certainly, early 20th century, it was appeals to science. But prior to that time, it was mostly religion. It was mostly the idea that these were heathen people outside the bonds of Christendom, and we needed to civilize them. Of course, once these Black folks became Christian, then they had to shift the rationale, right? And then you had to change the story. The iconography, I think, has to be addressed. And what I mean by that, I've thought about this for many, many, many years, ever since I was about to become a dad. I have a 19-year-old and a 17-year-old now. But when my wife was pregnant the first time with our first daughter, I remember going to her appointments where she would, go in just to check, make sure everything was okay. We're about halfway through the pregnancy, I think. And I'm sitting in a doctor's office in the waiting room while she's back getting some tests done. And I'm looking around, and I'm noticing, you always have like the magazines are out and, different things for people to read while they wait. And I don't know if this is true in New Jersey. I don't know if it's true everywhere, but certainly true in the South, that like all the doctor's offices, especially if it's pediatrician's offices or OBGYN or whatever, they all have Bible storybooks, right? They all have these blue books that were originally published in the 50s. I think they're the Robert Maxwell Bible story series for children. 12 volumes. They usually would only have volume 1. They'd only have the Genesis story because I guess somebody thinks that that one's not controversial, right? If we get into like, if we get into the quote unquote New Testament, then folks might blanch, but everybody agrees with the creation story that we've told. So you have the, volume 1, and I start looking through it. And I remember this book from my childhood. What was fascinating, right? I'm looking at it now as someone who's about to be a dad and who's thinking about like, how do children learn things? Because you don't remember necessarily how you learned stuff when you were little because you were little. But now as an older person, you're thinking about that with your own child. And I'm looking at the Bible book that kids will read, not necessarily my kids, because we weren't going to have these books, but other kids do. And, you open it up and there's God the Father in the clouds, white guy with a beard. That's the common iconography. There's Adam and Eve, right? Looking like they're in the Garden of Sweden, right? Not the Garden of Eden. You got Adam with short hair, like he just went and got a really nice haircut at the local haircutting place. He looks like Justin Bieber before the tattoos, right? You got Eve, looks like Vivian Lee from Gone with the Wind. That won't mean anything to the younger folks on the call, but some of the older folks will know what I'm talking about, right? This is absurd. This is not, of course, what the first human beings would have looked like. It is absolutely anthropologically, biologically impossible that the first human beings look like that, but that's the iconography people are seeing. We're seeing a white Jesus. The most common reproduced face of Jesus is Warner Salmon's Head of Christ, which was, it's been reproduced 50 million times, literally, if not more, around the world. It's that profile shot of Jesus with the blondish brown hair and the blue eyes. Again, anthropologically absurd for a first generation Palestinian Jew, right? But that's the imagery that is most commonly associated with Jesus. When that imagery is not questioned, when that's the imagery in the stained glass, when that's the imagery in the children's books, and no one questions it, it gives the impression, however subtly, that some people are closer to the creative force of the universe than others, and that others are further away. And that affects everybody's mentality. And I remember the first time I brought this up was 1998 at Regis University in Denver, Catholic institution. I brought it up and immediately people were like, well, Tim, it doesn't really matter what Jesus looked like. I mean, it only matters what Jesus did. And I'm like, well, I get that. I mean, I'm a Jew, so I don't necessarily see that exactly the same way y'all do, but I get it. Like, I get the story and I get what you're saying. But I said, if it doesn't matter what he looks like, why'd y'all make him look like this, right? Why is it that I'm standing under a crucifix with a white Jesus on it? If it doesn't matter what he looks like, why is that the way y'all made him look? And they're like, yeah, but see, it doesn't matter. Well, but it must, because y'all made him look like that. So why don't y'all just make him black for a year? Just a year, just see what happens. Just change him up. Well, we don't have to do that because it doesn't matter. But see, it must matter. So we do have to have that conversation about why we represent this in such a scientifically inaccurate way, first of all, and in a way that obviously reinforces various forms of supremacy. And I think the answer is rather obvious. If we were to actually represent Jesus, for instance, as Jesus would have looked as a first century Palestinian Jew whose skin tone would have been at least as dark as Osama bin Laden, at least as dark as Yasser Arafat, at least as dark as that, if not darker, then it would be much harder, wouldn't it, for people to be racist? Because now you'd be racist against peoples of color, of whom, if you're a Christian, your savior is such a person, right? So we have to have that conversation. I think church communities need to have that conversation and should have been having it for a long, long time.
Great. I know we're kind of in a little bit of a time crunch, so I'm going to skip ahead. 2 students have asked some questions, so I'd like to get to the student questions. The first one is, how can we affect real change? Because we talk about race issues and we have these seminars, then everybody goes back to their regular lives. Most white people don't want to talk about race issues because it doesn't affect them. Your take on teaching Black history in schools that could possibly change this narrative?
Well, I think we obviously need to teach better history. And a lot of that has to be the history of the struggle led by Black peoples. I think we also have to teach history differently with regard to the white folks that we talk about, though. Because the problem, again, if all we do, I mean, it'd be minute than nothing, but if all we do is make sure that we're teaching more accurate history of Black and brown peoples, we will, again, allow white folks to believe that this issue is just a Black and brown issue, because every time we talk about it, we're talking about them. I think it's really important for white folks to see that there are other types of white people in history too. The white people that we learn about are every bit as problematic as the fact that we don't learn enough about Black and brown folks. The white folks we learn about are founding fathers, usually industrialists and entrepreneurs and military heroes, right? We don't learn about white resistors. We don't learn about white folks who acted in solidarity with Black and brown leadership. And if we do learn about them, we only learn about the ones who were killed for it. We learn about the martyrs, maybe John Brown, maybe Goodman and Schwerner in Philadelphia, Mississippi in '64, maybe Viola Liuzzo, who was killed on the way back from the Selma to Montgomery March in 1965. But by and large, white folks who engaged in solidaristic behavior are not in the history books either. What does that do? That tells white people, this is not your struggle. At best, it's theirs and you can help them with it. Or at worst, you should just ignore it and go do something else. Go work on other issues because this isn't for you. So we got to do a better job of talking about the importance of Black and brown folks' history and accurate history, but we also have to tell a different white history, because the version of white history we're teaching right now encourages white people to think that they should just stand on the sidelines and maybe clap, or they should just not even pay attention to this at all and go do something else. Or maybe that they are inherently oppressors and have no role other than to be oppressors, because the white folks we're learning about tended to be those folks. You know, we learn about Andrew Jackson, obviously, and he's a president, I get it, we have to, but we don't learn about Jeremiah Everts, who was one of his primary opponents of indigenous removal. This is a white man who stood up and fought against indigenous removal led by Jackson, a white man. There were white folks in the Senate in the 1830s and 40s who were standing up against the imperialistic land grab in Mexico, right? Senators in the 1840s that were calling the war with Mexico a war of Anglo-Saxon aggression, right? We don't hear that kind of language from white folks today, but they were there then. So why don't we know their names? Well, you know, there are reasons why. So we got to do a better job on all of that.
Great. So hopefully we could have time for 2 more questions. The first is from another student. So when we talk about remembering who the enemy is, we talk about how the enemy is the deep-rooted system of racism. However, our system is run by people. Is it fair to assume everyone advocating or working for the system is oblivious? And what steps or consideration would we need to take in dealing with people who represent the institutions in this deep-rooted racism to where it is not interpersonal, like you indicated?
Yeah. Some are oblivious, some are quite active agents, obviously, of oppression. And it's important for us to know which are which. And sometimes you can't know, right? I mean, obviously you can't always know who's who. But I think you know, the average people that are running systems, right, tend to be much more directly implicated morally. They tend to be at a point where they pretty much know what they're doing. I think if you're the president and you're perpetuating racist hostility, you sort of know what you're doing. If you're the chief of police and you're covering up the crimes of your underlings, you know what you're doing. On the other hand, there are a lot of people who go into systems really wanting to change them. It could be as teachers, it could be as doctors, social workers, therapists, or even people who go into policing thinking that they're going to go in there and, you know, help keep people safe, who are transformed by that institution in a way that suppresses their better self and amplifies their lesser self. And so I think we want to try to distinguish and differentiate, even though it's not always easy to do. And I think that even in those instances where we're dealing with people who are quite active agents of oppression, we're still wanting to focus primarily on the systemic injustice, because let's take the president, for instance. I would say the president is very actively doing what he's doing. I mean, is he oblivious? Well, yeah, to a lot of things. Is he ignorant? Yes, about a lot of stuff, but he is quite culpable with his rhetoric. He knows enough about marketing to know what he's doing. That said, if I make my focus him as opposed to the system, then I think all I got to do is get rid of him and the problem goes away. So even in that case, we still want to focus most of our attention on the systemic forces that produced even a Donald Trump, right? Because Donald Trump is still a product of various systems, including his family, which is the first system into which he was born, including the schooling that he received. I'm not saying that lets him off the hook. I'm saying he is a product of that. And so if we want to stop creating people like that, either oblivious collaborators or active agents of oppression, we still got to fix the system. Otherwise, we're just like whacking moles, you know, like at the carnival, and then it just pops up somewhere else.
Great. So our last question is, can you discuss why the stereotypes of the angry Black woman is racist and a tactic to shut down the empowered voice, agency, and action of Black women challenging the injustices and disordered society?
Well, it's racist and misogynistic. And the reasons are that similar or greater levels of anger and hostility are evinced every day by white people and especially white men, and they aren't viewed through the same lens. They're not pathologized, right? I mean, this country was built by people who were really pissed off, right? Whether that was the enslaved people who were pissed off at their enslavement, obviously, but also, created functionally and governmentally by these white folks who were pissed in England, right? Who were pissed off and, dumping tea into the harbor in Boston and taking up arms against the British. That, there were no sit-ins at King George's palace. There were no nonviolent protests for independence. Like, this was just guns and blood. Lots of really angry people saying lots of really angry stuff. And we applaud that anger. We applaud that rage. We applaud that anger when it's Donald Trump yelling on Twitter in all caps. We applaud that anger when it's men, especially when they're white. And when a woman of any color, but especially a black woman or any woman of color does the same, it is viewed differently because I think there is a sort of obviously underlying misogyny and white supremacy, but there's also an underlying fear of black anger, right? Deep down, I think most white Americans know not exactly what has happened, but that some stuff has happened, right? That is foul and iniquitous. And we know that black folks know. And so when black folks raise their voice above a whisper, the fear in the back of a lot of white folks' minds, oh, today's payback day, right? We're really deeply worried that they are going to do to us what we did to them. I once had and I'll leave it with this because I know we're running out of time. I once had a great aunt who asked me a question half a lifetime ago. It was 1994. I was 26 and I was at a family reunion. It's an older white woman, and she sits me down in a family reunion. She knew what I did for a living and what I'd been doing for several years at that point. She said, Tim, and she said, heavy Southern accent. She said, Tim, she could always make my voice 2 syllables. Tim, do you think we're ever going to have a race war? Because she could make war a 2-syllable word too. And I said, what? And she said, yeah, do you think we're going to have a race war? And I said, well, I'm not sure what you mean by that. If what you mean by that is, do I think that black folks are going to come and burn down Whitey's neighborhood in payback and outrage at the history of white supremacy? No, I don't. And the reason I don't is if they were inclined to do that, they'd have torched this whole thing a long time ago, right? There'd have been nothing to hold them back. They would have just done it. So no, I don't. I do think, however, that kind of violence is possible, but it'll be initiated. It was initiated by our side. We're already in that war. That war started in 1619, right? If not before that. That war started with the conquest of the Americas. That war started with the extirpation of indigenous peoples. So I think sometimes we forget anger and rage and loud talking. That is, we do that all the time. And we view it very differently. We view it as leadership and strength and resolve. But when women do it, and particularly women of color, we view it as payback because we know that black women in particular know the deal better than probably any. Black women have been the leaders of resistance going back to the earliest iterations of white supremacy. And so we know they know the score, and we know that they are probably the most active resistors, and therefore the need to silence them, the need to denigrate them is more powerful than with any other group.
Great. Well, I think that's all the questions that came into the chat. So I'll turn it, and we are kind of at the 12:30 mark. So I'll turn it back over to Abdul to wrap us up.
All right, thank you, Colleen, and thanks, Tim, for joining us for this afternoon. What's afternoon for us and morning for you, I guess. Thanks everyone who participated. Please join us if you're part of the Caldwell community. Please join us on October 29th at 12 o'clock, where we are going to have a book and film discussion of The Color Purple. That information will be sent out in the campus info email. Again, thanks to our presenter. Thanks for all the students who participated and asked questions. Thanks again to our sponsors and co-sponsors. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me, Tim Kessler-Cleary, that is, or Colleen, for further information and guidance. Thank you so much and have a good day, everybody.
Thank you.